Welcome to this micro course, providing you with best practice skills and know-how. This session is given to you by the Van Haren Group, your partner to enable best practice learning. With your host, Maurits van der Plas.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this micro course about NIS2 and the ISO 27000. I will be here today with my presenter, Michiel Benda, author of the Navigator Guide to NIS2. Michiel, welcome. Thank you for participating.
Thank you.
And giving us insights about how the NIS2 relates to the ISO standard. To everybody joining, feel free to ask questions during the session. You don't just have to relate it to the topic, but you can also go in more depth about the NIS2 or ask more general questions about the NIS2. I will ask them during the session to Michiel or save them to the end, depending on the question if it matches the subject. Indeed, Michiel is author and expert in cybersecurity and NIS2. So feel free to ask him any question you might have or you might face in your daily business regarding or related to this subject. And then, Michiel, I would say, take it away.
Thank you. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for having me, Maurits. So we're discussing NIS2 and particularly how it relates to the ISO 27001. And just to make sure that we're all on the same page, NIS2 is a European directive, not to be confused with the NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is an American thing. And NIS2 is a directive that translates into local legislation, and it is all about cybersecurity for 100,000 plus European companies. So one of the things that we've seen when this launched in 2022, at the end of 2022, is a lot of discussion on, we can get ISO 27001 certified and then we're going to be compliant. And it's a rumor that's been going around, and actually there's a lot of it. It's not even false. It is just that nobody ever really wondered on the how you can be compliant. So that's what this session is about. So I kind of giving away the clue. ISO 27001, yes, can absolutely be used to certify on or to be compliant with NIS2. And no, you don't even have to be certified. You just have to be compliant to it. Certification does help. It's a nice piece of proof that you are compliant. So let's just have a look at the two topics here, the NIS2 on the one hand and the ISO 27001 framework. I explicitly don't want to call it a standard because that tends to confuse that it's going to be a bunch of controls. So, the framework against the directive. The first thing you need to know, NIS2 addresses cybersecurity. Now, a lot of you are going to say, okay, yeah, that's what ISO 27001 does as well. Well, to a certain extent, ISO 27001 addresses information security. And I'll go into that in a second, to show you the difference between the two. NIS2 is a piece of legislation that is focused on resilience, but resilience not of so much of your organization. That's typically what the ISO 27001 wants. NIS2 is concerned about European Union resilience. Both, and this is where a big match comes in, take a risk-based approach. And then we have NIS2, which has a baseline of measures that anyone that is within the scope of the NIS2 has to comply with. Whereas on the other hand, you have the ISO, which is much more generically focusing. You have these risks. You need to address them. Here's a set of controls that you can look at and determine what's relevant for you or justify what's not. So let's have a look here and first take that distinction between cybersecurity and information security. It's a topic that's always been a bit of a discussion, there's a lot of people that say, no, cybersecurity is the bigger one, information security is a subset, IT security is the overall. And for me, in the end, when you look at information security, it is about securing information. It's a very holistic concept. It includes any information that you would have. That can be hard copy information. It can be something that people in the workforce hold. It can be physical locations, whatever else. When you look at cybersecurity, it's a subset. It focuses still on the information, but it focuses explicitly on digital information. So that becomes a subset for me of information security. Now, cybersecurity is typically about the digital communications. It is about cloud. It is about the interaction with the open world. That's where we talk about cybersecurity. So you will actually see on this picture a lot of the areas that are typically in cybersecurity are any parts that relate with cloud. When we look at IT security is more on the inside of your organization. So when we look at IT security, there's a lot of topics in there. I put SCADA and operational technologies in here, and I realized that those of you that are deeply into it, we're going to argue and say, well, that's not part of IT security. There's only an overlap. I just did not want to confuse the picture even more by introducing that one and then introducing another part of physical security. So yes, before you even asked the question, I completely agree. Operational security is not just a subset of IT security. There's a much broader perspective on that. But this is where it is. So when you look at cybersecurity, it's actually a subset of what the ISO 27001 wants you to do. ISO 27001 says, you protect your information assets in the broader scale of things. NIS2 focuses specifically on that digital data stream, on anything that occurs within what we call cyberspace, which interestingly enough has never been defined in legal terms by anyone in the European Union. So when we have that distinction, let's take that next step. And where we said, okay, the focus on resilience is very different between the two. The NIS2 Directive was introduced because the European Union is very concerned about protecting, its way of life, the freedom of the citizens, the welfare of citizens. So you will see that NIS2 is actually focused much more on making sure that we as a union are able to stand up in the world. And yes, a part of that means that we are going to have resilience in your entity, but the primary focus in the end is that the resilience of your entity has to line up with the ultimate resilience of the European Union. And clearly, ISO 27001 was not written to protect the European Union. Now, it is a standard that is specifically focused on how you as an organization can become resilient. And the difference that you will see, which is a big difference in the ISO versus the NIS2, is where the ISO actually just talks about things like, we have a generic impact. European Union says, no, consider the impact that it has on us in our economy, in our society. And I'll show you that a bit more in a later slide.
Michiel, can I share a few questions and comments? If that's okay.
Absolutely, be fine.
So I'm not sure, I think you partially covered it, but one question here from Rob Hulsebos, he wrote it in Dutch, but what he asked is for businesses that cover the ISO 27K, that there are a lot of agreements in it, but is that enough? Do you really need to match them all? Because that's really a lot of content that you need to match.
So okay,
for businesses. Sorry.
Repeat the question, please, because I see the question here in Dutch, but I'm not sure you're wording the same thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm wording it as well, because maybe you can repeat it in English if that's easier for you to translate it.
So the one I see here now is companies that have operational technologies. Does the ISO 27K cover that? And there's a lot of similarities, but is it enough? That's the question we're answering, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Okay. So obviously, when we talk about operational technologies, there's a whole different ISO standard, the 62443, which is specifically into what you need to do for OT. I think when you look at the NIS2, the NIS2 is all about cybersecurity. And when we talk about the cybersecurity element, it is actually, if we compare that to the OT part, it is very much the OT communications element going into the cloud, doing that, the cyberspace element of it. So it's much less on the let's call it the operations line, which is more on the IT security. Now, this is where NIS2 stays a bit vague, because you would expect that if there is a disruption on your production lines or on your SCADA, whatever, that's going to have a big economic impact. So you would expect that that would be a NIS2 element. What I would expect there is where that becomes essential is when we look at the Critical Entity Resilience Directive, which is a second directive actually that came out at the same time. And that covers much more of the operational technologies. I think when we cover, when we're talking about compliance to NIS2, we're talking about the resilience in cyberspace. My current expectation would be that if you take that 27K approach to it, you will cover OT. Mind you, I'm talking very much about the ISO 27001 framework and not so much the set of controls that we have, because that's a different ballgame altogether. So I hope that kind of answers Rob's question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you. And then we got another one here, and then we got a few more questions and comments, but we'll leave that for later. Then we just got Mark Tissink here mentioning overarching risk management, where our cybersecurity risk and compliance risk NIS2 is the latter. I guess we can agree on that.
So it depends a bit on your approach, obviously. So being compliant with NIS2 is a compliance risk. Content-wise, NIS2 says you need to do a cyber risk management or cyber risk assessment. So in order to address the compliance risk of NIS2, you will actually have to do the cyber risk assessment. So this is one of those legislations where I would say, there's a double truth in here. Yeah, the directive itself is a risk management directive. It requires you to do a cyber risk assessment. If you don't do that, you're not compliant to the law. That's a compliance issue. So I hope that clarifies what Mark is asking. If not, then by all means, have him elaborate on it.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you. Okay, I'll let you get back to the slides.
All right. So when we look at that, that risk, and Mark was actually giving a very nice handover on that. Let's have a look at the risk definition that NIS2 has. So there's Article 6, which is the article that contains all the definitions that NIS2 actually holds, well, almost all. There's one or two exceptions. And we look at the 9th one in there, which defines risk. And risk, it says, is the potential for loss or disruption caused by an incident, which is a very nice and broad definition. But on the other hand, also one that kind of limits it, because they're already talking about an incident. So they're talking about harm, and in general, you'll see that in the generic terms, we're talking about threats and opportunities as well. So when we talk about risk here, they say it's an expression of the magnitude of loss or disruption and the likelihood of occurrence of the incident. If I then look at the ISO, and then instead of the 27001, we actually jump into the 27000. And you'll see that that has paragraph 3.61, and it actually says it's an effect on uncertainty on objectives, positive or negative. The effect is a deviation from expected, and uncertainty is the state of deficiencies. Lots of kind of elaborations. There's like 6 notes just to this one simple definition of really 5 words that they gave. The most interesting one for me there is note number 6, which says the potential that threats will exploit vulnerabilities of an information asset or group of information assets and thereby cause harm to an organization. So what they're referring to here is typically the definition of an information security risk. This is what they refer to. And if you look at the latter part, then actually there is a very close match to what the NIS2 defines as risk. So the two are pretty much on the same page, I would say. Yeah, NIS2, and I've taken the quotes of the articles there on some of the terms. Article 21, first paragraph says, entities take measures to manage the risks posed to the security of network and information systems, which those entities use. Very simple, the ... dots is a lot of the wooliness that you will find in the language of the law, but this is the essence of what it says. Yeah, and it specifically mentions the security of your network and information systems, again referring to the cybersecurity risk. Then when we look at that, and this becomes interesting, it looks at the definition of what security of network information systems is, and it is the ability of network and information systems to resist any event that may compromise the availability, authenticity, integrity, or confidentiality of the data or the services. Now, I've put it in bold there because you will see that the security experts among us, this is an element that's introduced here that is not normally addressed, which is authenticity. If we look at 27001, paragraph 612 actually says there's an information security risk assessment. The organization shall define and apply information security risk assessment process that identifies the information security risks and applies the information security risk assessment process to identify the risks associated with the laws of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So what we see here is, even though the definitions are very similar and both use a risk-based approach, you will see that they've introduced an element. Actually, this element, the authenticity, was already in the original NIS back in 2016. I don't think it's really been emphasized. I have no idea how much they're going to emphasize its relevance in this version, but it is there. So we have our CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, which is what you will typically see that companies address in the ISO 27001 certification. But this says you have to look at authenticity. Then authenticity is one of those vague terms that when I talk about it, and especially when I talk about it in trainings, people always refer back to saying, oh yeah, but that's just a part of integrity. Integrity talks about completeness and accuracy of the information. Authenticity talks about sender and receiver. They are not the same thing. Authenticity says the person that is giving me this information is really the person that they claim to be, or on the other side, the person that is receiving the information is really the person that they claim to be. Integrity does not come into this equation. Someone can be giving you completely sound information, complete, accurate, but they're going to hand it over to someone that is not who he claims to be. Then you have an authenticity issue, and there's nothing wrong with the integrity. So make sure that there's a distinction between the two. And authenticity, we see it in information security and cybersecurity risks all the time now. It's the typical CEO frauds. It is the deep fake kind of thing that is very popular nowadays. So authenticity is a big thing. When you address ISO 27001 certification and you have to match it to NIS2, this is an element you have to address. You have to consider the risks on authenticity and you have to address them. Then we have the impact factors. So, both of them say, okay, you have a risk, and there is a chance of an incident, and an incident, leads to consequences and leads to impact. First thing to realize is impact and consequences are not the same. Consequences are the outcomes of an event affecting objectives. This is an ISO 27000 definition again, and it's loss of or reduced confidentiality, integrity, or availability. Impact is the damage resulting from the consequences. So when we talk about the impact factors here, we're not talking about the CIA. We're talking about what harm it can do to you as a company. And then typically you'll see that there's going to be financial and there's going to be non-financial impact. ISO doesn't really specify what kind of impacts you should be concerned with. So typically what you'll see is factors like the ones you see at the bottom of that slide, financial, so your cost, injuries, reputational damage, compliance damage, operational damage. NIS2, however, states there are some very specific impact factors that you have to consider. And that's, like I said before, societal impact. So any impact on society, any impact on the economy are considerations you have to do. So even if you are ISO 27001 certified and you have not included your considerations in your risk for societal and economic impact, then you're really not compliant. And I've added the bonus here because we've actually already seen in development like this in the past. It's just never been explicitly realized, which is what the GDPR said. GDPR said, no, don't just look at impact factors of your own organization. Look at impact factors on people, on the subjects of the data. So you will see that impact is more specified, and it's actually broader than most companies would include in their assessments. When assessing the proportionality, due account shall be taken of the degree of the entity's exposure to risk, the entity's size, the likelihood of occurrence of incidents, and their severity, including their societal economic impact. So this is literally the text out of the NIS2. All right, and then we get to that set of controls, and I've actually already said in the beginning, ISO says you have to have a set of controls to address the risks you've identified. And have a look at our Annex A, and we've listed a whole bunch of them, and just explain to us if you don't want to use them, why you're not using them. And that can be for any reason. It doesn't specify what reason. It just says look at them and justify them. The overview in this tree that you see here is the overview of the requirements, the baseline that the NIS2 actually requires you to do. So NIS2 says, yes, you have to do a risk assessment. You have to classify your risks. You have to make sure that your risks are acceptable. But at a very minimum, and this is Article 21, Paragraph 2, at the very minimum, you have to have these measures in place. And they've listed point A through J, but if you really read them, there's some of them are kind of combined that really don't combine very well. So you get this list of controls. Now I can name them all, and we can spend a whole day just going through them. And actually, this is what I do in the NIS2 training that's actually associated with the book that I published. But let's skip that for now, and let's just have a look at what the ISO 27001, or in this case the 27002 controls actually match to the NIS2. So I've put the controls there just for your reference, and you'll see that actually most of these controls, there is some element at least that addresses them. There's already one that you will see that has no match at all, and that's the emergency communication system. So NIS2, in its final bullet of the required controls, actually says you need to have an emergency communication system for your internal organization. No control on the ISO. So this is a bonus one that you have to add. Mind you, 27001 is not a set of controls. So if you say, well, we added that control and we're verifying it and we included it in our statement of applicability, our auditor is auditing it, yes, you can still be ISO 27001 certified and you can be perfectly compliant with the NIS2. But just based out of the set of the 93 controls that the ISO currently has, this one is lacking. Then we have another one, which is, let's have a look at what they really say and then have a comparison between the two. And what you will see then is that in a lot of these areas, there is actually specifics within the NIS2 that are not explicit in the control sets. So yes, there is a control, but there are areas where ISO doesn't really give you the requirements explicitly as the NIS2 does. So if we look at vulnerability management, coordinated vulnerability disclosures, and the handling of them is not mentioned in the ISO control. So you can get certified without having this. If you don't have it, you're not NIS2 compliant. And awareness training, yes, absolutely, there's awareness training in the ISO. NIS2 gives you specifics. It says you need to have phishing exercises, you need to have social engineering knowledge, you need to have cyber threat knowledge. So there's 3 specific elements in your awareness training that you have to include, not mentioned in the ISO. Yeah, there's strong authentication, yeah, but there is no hard multi-factor authentication or continual authentication requirement mentioned in there. So strong authentication is up to your imagination in the ISO, but again, a specific requirement in the NIS2. Zero trust for me was always the biggest surprise. It talks about basic cyber hygiene in the NIS2. And when you look at that, that's a very vague term, right? So when you go through that legislation, you will actually see there is a recital in there that clarifies what they mean by basic cyber hygiene. And one of the points that they mention in there is zero trust principles. For me, that's a pretty heavy one, but who am I to judge the law, right? I'm here to make sure that we're compliant. The basic cyber hygiene, zero trust principles is not a core element in the control set of the ISO 27001. Protection of the supply chain. Yeah, and mind you, the ISO has something on supply chain policies and procedures. It doesn't have a proactive support. If you look at NIS2, it has very specific requirements. It requires you to do the protection, the active protection of the supply chain. And it mentioned that you have to do it throughout the supply chain. You have to do relationship management with your direct suppliers. And you have to look at specific vulnerabilities of each of your suppliers. So again, a lot of details in here that you can get away with in an ISO 27001 certification, but that does not make you compliant. Incident management, I think this one is the most obvious one. Yes, you have incident management. There's plenty of controls in the ISO 27001. But then NIS2 has very specific requirements: a 24-hour early notification, a 72-hour incident report requirement, just like GDPR has. A reporting requirement after a month. So there is different elements that are specific now that you need to consider and need to put into your incident management procedures. Business continuity, I think, is the trickiest one. And business continuity is the one where we say, okay, well, ISO says you need to have information security continuity. NIS2 says you need to have business continuity in place. And it mentions a couple of things. It includes crisis management. It includes disaster recovery. It includes business continuity itself, and it includes backup. So some of the elements are there, but this is very much a core element in the NIS2. It's about resilience. Yeah, ISO says your information security needs to be resilient. NIS says your business needs to be resilient. Yeah, I notice we're running out of time here, so I'm not sure if we want to continue this, or do you want to open up for questions, Maurits?
I think so. We got a few questions, which maybe if you're okay with it, we'll discuss afterwards. Feel free to, let's say, finish the presentation, I think, and
we're on the last slide. So then let me just mention the last ones. The risk analysis actually mentioned that one. We have analyze the impact on society and the economy, which is very specific in the NIS2. Emergency communications, as I said before, there's no specifications. HR security, typically ISO 27001 has something on joiner mover lever, but what specifically in joiner mover lever is not really mentioned. So the NIS2 has specific background checks, criminal record checks, categorization of your employees. So there is specific elements in HR security that they want to address. Yeah, and then the last one is actually a very unique one. They have an effectiveness policy and procedures. Now, an effectiveness policy is completely new for me. I've been doing this for over 30 years now. I never heard of an effectiveness policy. I looked it up on Google. It gave me absolutely 0 hits. Well, it actually gave me a few hits, but they're all irrelevant. So a policy on this level is something new. And I'm not sure if the writers of the law actually realize that. But yeah, they want a policy. Well, I guess we're going to have to give them one. Obviously, procedures on effectiveness, they need to be in place. And it's not something new. It's just not very explicit in the ISO controls. So, just to summarize it all, yes, ISO 27001 framework is absolutely one that you can use to become compliant because it's a framework about risk management. Yeah, and it says identify your risks and make sure you have your controls in place to address them. If you go for the core way that the ISO is set up and just use the control set that the ISO has, no, you're not going to be compliant. So you have to take a broader interpretation of the 27001 framework. Yeah, and then business continuity is definitely one that's absent. So my advice, if you are in the ISO frame of mind, have a look at the ISO 22301, which is the business continuity management system, and aligns very nicely with the ISO 27001, which is the information security management system. And the two can be combined, gives you a good effort, and it gives you a good way to address the actual business continuity. Incident reporting, as I said, is one to pay attention to. And then finally, the supply chain, which is, I think, going to be the biggest nightmare for most companies that have to comply with the NIS2, because supply chain goes deep. There is, there can be suppliers to your suppliers, to their suppliers, to, and all the way down the line. And how you're going to control it is really up to your imagination. I have some ideas, but we'll leave them out of the scope of this presentation. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much. So first, a few comments. So here we got a compliment on your previous explanation
Thank you.
regarding what you need to meet. Then indeed we got, so I think we covered most of the content. So one of the questions, I think you recognize the author of the question. What can you do to cover the NIS2? Well, I think you explained how to do it by following the ISO. If you already have the ISO. Besides that, I guess start with doing the gap assessment, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so one of the things that you'll see in the book, I've created an Annex F in there, is a very extensive assessment that actually addresses the NIS2. So you can do that assessment, and it gives you a very good idea of what you need to do. There's nice action points in there. We have a digital version for anyone that prefers to do that in Excel. It's in 5 languages, including Dutch, Spanish, Italian, German, English, obviously.
Yeah, obviously. Thank you. So I guess that's a good way to start. Then from Sylvian responded, thank you, and thank you for the explicit elaboration regarding the supply chain. Can you reference now their cyber framework? This is a question, correct? Can you maybe? Okay,
so to which extent are they complemented? I have to say, I don't know the Air Cyber framework, so I can't really tell you much about that. So the supply chain controls are going to be risk-based. So there's a distinction between two categories in your supply chain. You can see the ones that have to comply with the NIS2 themselves, because NIS2 actually has that essential important entity distinction. And you'll see in the important entities is typically the ones supplying the essential entities. That's where you see a lot of that area covered. So for those, it's going to be easy because you can refer to being NIS2 compliant themselves, and they have to be compliant by law anyway. It's the ones that are outside of that scope that you have to address, and that's the tricky part. There is no rule in the NIS2 that says you have to force the NIS2 base control set on them. NIS2 says you have to be in control of your risks. So what you need to do in your supply chain is make sure that the risks that you have, in this case in cybersecurity, that they are adequately addressed by the supply chain. And then you have to do assessments of that. So my typical way of doing that is instructing my direct suppliers to verify their direct suppliers and to instruct their direct suppliers to do the same to their suppliers, and then follow the chain down. And then you can kind of get a feeling. There is an exercise being conducted, but I don't know the progress of it, but it's by the European Commission. They're instructing the ENISA, which is the cybersecurity group in Europe, to do some of the larger supply chains. So one of my hopes here is that they are going to address the big supply chains like the Microsoft clouds and the Amazon clouds and the Google clouds, because there is no way that the vast majority of the entities is going to be able to get an understanding of what that chain is going to be like in those companies. So there is an option, and then that would be nice, and then we can rely on the results of ENISA rather than having to do it ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, I think this was it. We got a few thank yous for the session, and thank you for your time, Michiel, and thank you for elaborating to us, and hopefully to the next session.
Sounds good to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for participating. Goodbye. Bye.
We at the Van Haren Group believe that organizations can benefit from shared knowledge and experiences, and we try to help them to do so. We are an independent, worldwide recognized content provider in management best practices and standards, well known for its flexibility and years of experience. Our education partners offer specialized training using our books, courseware, e-learnings, and exams. These partners play a crucial role in delivering high-quality education to professionals, leveraging our products to ensure comprehensive and effective learning experiences. At Van Haren Group, we're more than just a publisher. Our unwavering commitment to quality, passion, trust, fairness, and forward-thinking drives everything we do. We are dedicated to empowering professionals and organizations worldwide to achieve their goals and thrive in today's dynamic landscape. Dream, learn, and achieve with Van Haren Group.
Do you want to apply a best practice yourself and maybe leverage our services? Do get in contact with us. We are more than happy to advise how to take the next step.
We at the